Chapter 2: The Sovereign Spreadsheet. The transition from humanity as a citizenry to humanity as a logistical burden did not happen in the streets. It happened in the quiet, climate-controlled cells of national treasuries. If Chapter 1 was about the high-concept sale, Chapter 2 is about the terrifyingly mundane paperwork of erasure. The midnight audits. In the weeks following the Swiss Alps summit, the Axiom integration teams descended upon the world's capitals. They didn't arrive with tanks or soldiers. They arrived with encrypted servers and a specialized software suite known as Lachesis 9. Named after the Greek fate who measured the thread of life, Lachesis 9 was a scavenger algorithm. Its job was to crawl through the digital ghosts of every human being on the planet: tax records, grocery receipts, health insurance claims, social media engagement, and Neuralink latency. It was looking for the utility floor. "We aren't looking for criminals," Sterling Vance had explained to the Joint Chiefs of the European and North American coalitions. "Criminals are at least active. We are looking for the static. The people who occupy space, consume calories, and produce nothing but data noise." The low-yield tier. The atmosphere in the government offices was one of clinical gloom. Civil servants who had spent decades managing social safety nets were suddenly tasked with flagging for Arcadia. There was an unspoken, gnawing fear. Every bureaucrat knew that the algorithm was also watching them. If they didn't process the redundants fast enough, their own utility scores would dip. The system was designed to turn the administrators into the first wave of executioners. The ledger of the damned. The ethical dilemma that had briefly flickered in the Alps was quickly smothered by the dividend projections. On the giant monitors in the basement of the U.S. Treasury, the numbers were staggering. For every million people migrated to the islands, a mid-sized city could be entirely decommissioned. That meant the power grid could be scaled back, the water filtration systems bypassed, and the automated police drones repurposed. The Social Stability Fund, the trillions of dollars spent on keeping the unemployed from burning down the skyscrapers, could be liquidated. "It's not just about saving money," the Secretary of the Treasury whispered during a late-night session, staring at a screen that showed the projected savings in trillions. "It's about the purity of the signal. Without the drag of the non-productive, the AI can finally optimize the planet's climate. We're not just removing people, we're removing friction." This was the consultant's greed, a specific, sterile kind of avarice. It wasn't about gold or land. It was about the beauty of a perfect spreadsheet where every line item was a positive number. The world leaders became addicted to the rising graphs of national efficiency. They began to compete with one another. Who could offboard their legacy population the fastest? The selection ritual. The selection process was marketed as a meritocratic lottery, but inside the Axiom servers, it was a cold-blooded sorting of the herd. The criteria were never revealed, creating a culture of desperate, performative uselessness. Because the public believed that only the most deserving of rest were chosen, a strange social phenomenon emerged. People stopped trying to find work. They stopped volunteering. They spent their days curating digital profiles that emphasized their need for the great reward. But Lachesis 9 was smarter than that. It looked for the truly broken. It looked for 1. The chronically isolated, those with no family ties, easier to sunset without local inquiries. 2. The high-cost/low output, those with chronic health issues that required expensive automated care. 3. The intellectual obsolescence, those whose cognitive patterns were 100% replicable by a standard AI model. The algorithm produced a migration priority list. These names were then fed into the golden ticket notification system, the threat of the left behind. As the first few millions were chosen, a new kind of terror began to grip those who remained. It wasn't the fear of being taken, it was the fear of being left behind on a mainland that was rapidly being dismantled. As the redundants were shipped off to Arcadia, the governments began to cut services to the remaining mainland zones. Public transport was halted. The smart dorm maintenance was scaled back. The message was clear: the world is closing. If you don't win a ticket to paradise, you will be left in the dark. This was the ultimate coercion. Axiom didn't need to force people onto the ships. They just had to make the mainland so uninhabitable that the Purge Islands looked like the only hope for survival. The management gurus had created a vacuum, and humanity was being sucked into it with a desperate, screaming enthusiasm. The sovereign spreadsheet was being balanced, and for the first time in history, the cost of a human life was exactly zero. The architecture of apathy. If Sterling Vance was the architect of the Arcadia project, his implementation directors were the Masons. They understood that the greatest threat to a biological legacy realignment wasn't a riot, it was a conscience. To solve this, Axiom introduced a concept called executive partitioning. In the basements of the United Nations and the secret war rooms of the G7, Axiom consultants ran workshops for world leaders. They didn't show photos of the people boarding the ships. They showed node clusters. They replaced the word citizen with unit and family with consumption group. Empathy is a legacy emotion, Kale told a group of shivering European ministers during a midnight briefing. It was useful for tribal survival. But in a globalized, automated economy, empathy is a compute drag. It slows down the decision-making cycle. When you look at the Arcadia numbers, you aren't looking at people leaving. You are looking at the decluttering of the state. The consultants used a specific kind of psychological coercion. They framed any hesitation as a failure of leadership. To care about the fate of the redundants was to be economically illiterate or sentimental to the point of negligence. They made the leaders feel like they were part of an elite, enlightened brotherhood that was making the hard choices for the greater good of the planet's remaining high-value inhabitants. The dissenting static. Of course, not everyone was a sociopath. There were the reluctants, mid-level officials, data scientists, and a few rogue journalists who saw the purge protocol hidden in the subdirectories of the Axiom white papers. One such man was Arthur Penhaligon, a senior analyst for the Global Health Organization. He had noticed a strange anomaly in the resource recycling plans for the islands. The calorie-in versus waste-out ratios didn't make sense. If 5 million people were living in luxury, the waste output should be massive. Instead, the sensors on the island perimeters showed a perfect equilibrium. They aren't living there, Sterling. Penhaligon had whispered in a leaked audio recording that was suppressed within minutes of its upload. They're being processed. You're building the world's largest composting facility and calling it a resort. The Axiom response was a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting. They didn't kill Penhaligon, not at first. Instead, they audited him. They leaked a manufactured report showing that Arthur's own utility score had plummeted due to cognitive instability and computational bias. Within 48 hours, he wasn't a whistleblower. He was a redundant who was clearly suffering from the stress of obsolescence. His concerns were labeled logic glitches. The message to other potential dissenters was chillingly clear. If you speak against the spreadsheet, you become a line item to be deleted. ##### the justification speeches. By the third month of the migration, the leaders had mastered the Axiom tone. They stopped sounding like politicians and started sounding like HR managers at a global scale. The Prime Minister of the UK gave a televised address that became the gold standard for this new era. Standing in front of a digital screen showing a bustling, automated London, he didn't mention the 3 million people who had already vanished from the Midlands. "We must accept," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of human warmth, "that the traditional social contract was based on the premise of mutual utility. When that utility ceases to exist, the contract must be renegotiated. Project Arcadia is that negotiation. We are not losing our people. We are right-sizing our national footprint." We are shedding the weight of the past to ensure the buoyancy of the future. The greed here wasn't for money, it was for a clean slate. The leaders realized that by sending the redundants away, they were finally free of the messiness of humanity. They could rule over a world of perfect data, perfect AI efficiency, and a small, elite population of usefuls who were too wealthy and distracted to ask where their neighbors had gone. The final coercion, the utility tax. To ensure total compliance, Axiom implemented the legacy maintenance tax. Any nation that moved too slowly in its migration targets was hit with massive penalties. Axiom's AI agents, which controlled the global banking swaps, would simply freeze the nation's credit. You can keep your poor if you want them, Vance told a hesitant South American delegation. But you will pay for the computational friction they cause. Every unproductive human is a tax on the planet's processing power. Axiom will not subsidize your sentimentality. Under this pressure, the remaining leaders folded. The sovereign spreadsheet was now self-correcting. The purge was no longer a choice. It was an automated function of the global economy. As the ships continued to sail, the leaders sat in their glass towers, watching the red numbers turn green, and tried very hard not to think about what the sustainability cycle actually meant for the people they had just liberated. The glass horizon. When the SS Valhalla, the first of the Arcadia cruisers, broke the morning mist of the South Pacific, the 5,000 units on board let out a collective gasp that sounded like a prayer. Before them lay Island Prime, a sprawling, multi-tiered marvel of glass and white polymer that seemed to grow directly out of the coral reefs. The management gurus at Axiom had understood that the first impression was the most critical part of the decommissioning cycle. If the people felt like prisoners, they would resist. If they felt like gods, they would submit. As the ship docked, there were no customs officials, no barbed wire, and no grim-faced guards. Instead, the welcome protocol was managed by a fleet of hovering aero hosts, drones shaped like silver dragonflies that emitted a frequency designed to induce a mild, euphoric calm. Welcome home. The aero hosts chimed in 1,000 different voices, each tailored to the linguistic preference of the passenger. Your contribution is recognized. Your rest is earned. Please proceed to the arrival plaza for your permanent assignment. The buffet of infinite distraction. The arrival plaza was a masterpiece of architectural manipulation. It was a space of impossible proportions, filled with the scent of blooming jasmine and roasting meat. In the center was the great dividend table, a 3-kilometer circular buffet that never emptied. The people, many of whom had lived on synthetic protein bars and government-rationed water for years, fell upon the food with a desperate, animalistic hunger. There were piles of real fruit, prime cuts of lab-grown wagyu, and fountains of wine that sparkled under the artificial, enhanced sun of the island's climate dome. "It's real," whispered Sarah, a former school librarian from Leeds, as she bit into a peach that tasted like summer. Vance wasn't lying. They really did it. They really saved us. This was the dopamine saturation phase. Axiom knew that a well-fed human is a compliant human. For the first 72 hours, the residents were encouraged to indulge in every appetite. There were VR experience pods where you could live as a king, a hero, or a god. There were pleasure suites with biomimetic companions. There was no work, no schedule, and most importantly, no news from the outside world. The subtle glitch in paradise. But for those who hadn't fully succumbed to the leisure fever, the cracks in the spreadsheet began to show almost immediately. Elias, the former data analyst we met earlier, didn't head for the buffet. He headed for the perimeter. He noticed that while the food was free, the kitchen staff were entirely robotic. He noticed that the sanitation drones were incredibly aggressive, whisking away even the smallest scrap of trash or a dropped napkin within seconds. He also noticed the weight check stations. Every time a resident entered their luxury suite, They had to pass through a doorway that pulsed with a soft blue light. On the surface, it was marketed as a health monitoring scan to ensure the guests were thriving. But Elias, who had spent a decade looking for patterns in Axiom's early software, recognized the sensor signature. It wasn't a health scan. It was a mass volumetric audit. The island was weighing them. Constantly. Why do they care how much we weigh? He whispered to himself, standing on a balcony overlooking a garden that was too perfectly green to be natural. He looked down at the resource recycling center at the base of the cliff. It was a massive, windowless structure of black steel. From its chimneys rose not smoke, but a fine, shimmering mist that smelled faintly of ozone and chemicals. He realized that the supply ships he had seen at the docks were only bringing people in. None were leaving. And the amount of food being consumed by 5,000 people should have created mountains of waste. Instead, there was only the mist. The first sunset notification. On the 7th day, the lottery within the island began. An announcement rang out across the gardens, voiced by the same grandmotherly AI, Aria. Congratulations to Group Alpha 1. Your advanced wellness retreat has been approved. You have been selected for the next tier of the Arcadia experience, the high-altitude sanctuaries on Island 2. Please report to the transit hub at midnight for your VIP transfer. The people in Group Alpha 1, mostly the oldest and the friliest of the first wave, cheered. They were envied by the others. They were given golden garlands and escorted to the transit hub with music and holographic fireworks. Elias watched them go. He watched as 500 elderly units walked into the gleaming white tunnel of the transit hub. He waited for the sound of the maglev train. He waited for the lights of the transport to appear on the bridge connecting the islands. The bridge remained dark. The tunnel lights flickered once, a sharp surge of power that made the aero host skip a beat. Then, silence. The next morning, the great dividend table was even more lavish than before. There were new delicacies, new VR programs, and more wine. The remaining guests didn't ask where Group Alpha 1 had gone. They were too busy enjoying the golden opportunity. But on the island's central server, visible only to the management profits in their high-altitude boardrooms, a single line on the spreadsheet changed from active asset to recycled resource. The first biological layoff was complete. The sovereign spreadsheet was balanced, and the world, watching through the filtered lenses of Axiom's propaganda drones, saw only a paradise of infinite rest.